Welcome to Pratidhwani, where we try to humanize science. It is my delight and pleasure to welcome my very dear friend Kumaraswamy Guruswamy to Pratidhwani. Guru, as we know him very closely, is an outstanding scientist, also a science communicator, and probably in a very different format, also is an excellent human being, in my opinion. And I have had a great learning and also a great friendship. And anybody who knows Guru would feel this similar thing. Guru has done some excellent work on polymer science, including polymer chemistry and polymer physics and related issues. And off late, he's also been deeply interested in sustainability related problems. So we will get to know more about the horse itself. Welcome to Pratidhwani, Guru.
Thank you very much, Pawan. It's a pleasure. It's long overdue, and my apologies. It's largely my fault.
Thanks a lot for being here. So, Guru, we're going to actually get started with the origins. Tell us, where were you born, and when were you born, and how did you really get interested in science?
Thank you. So, when was I born? That's a sensitive question, I guess, but
Yeah.
especially as I'm growing old, I guess.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm a Mumbaikar, right?
Okay,
I'm born
okay.
in Western Maharashtra. I lived for most of my life in Western Maharashtra, Pune, and Mumbai. So I was born in Mumbai,
Hmm.
in a suburb called Chembur.
Okay.
And it's funny, I tell people that I learned spectroscopy by looking at the skies, because we were right next to the RCF factory, and you could sort of tell what they were emitting by looking at this, the colors you would see in the sky.
Sorry.
So yeah, I grew up in a very I guess a fairly common situation for a lot of us, um, middle class, comfortable upbringing. Did my schooling in Chembur, and did my undergraduate education in Mumbai as well. I went to IIT Bombay, and so that entire journey until the point that I went to undergraduate was all in Mumbai.
Nice, nice. So, Mumbai means also that you already are in a situation which is very cosmopolitan. And what is the kind of experience you had at your home? Did you already have academic kind of inclination then? And how was the atmosphere at your home?
So I lived in a largely a nuclear family.
Mm.
My grandmother and my uncle also lived with us, but I lived in a nuclear family for the most part. My family background is not in science,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
So I have a lot of bankers and chartered accountants and lawyers in the family.
Okay.
In fact, my father has a degree in law and a degree in he's a chartered accountant by profession, and that was sort of the tradition, right? At that time, almost everyone in the family had a first degree in law, and then they did whatever they
Whatever
really
they want.
wanted.
Yes, yes.
So no, not so much, I don't
Mm.
think. But growing up, my extended family, a lot of my extended family lived in Mumbai as well. So I remember growing up and my aunt sort of telling me that, oh, I'd like to see you become an engineer, and for reasons I don't fully understand, right? Because uh, her kids didn't they were not
Mm.
engineers. Maybe that is the reason, right?
Mm.
That she wanted me to be an engineer. So yeah, so I didn't grow up with a family background that had science as such, but I grew up in a very cosmopolitan area. So
Mm.
if I look at my school, we had people from every background. So I went to the local
Mm.
school in Mumbai. Um, as a private school, but it was state government aided,
Mm.
and which meant that the fees were low enough that you had the whole spectrum of society come, which is, I think, tremendous. You don't see that as much if you look at sort of CBSE schools or ICSE schools today. You don't see that kind of a background, and I think there's a lot to be
Mm.
said
Mm.
for learning to grow up with
Go.
people with very different backgrounds. And so, apart from that, it's not just that people came from different socioeconomic backgrounds. I mean, so people also came from widely different cultural backgrounds, right? So, growing up in Mumbai,
Mm. Mm.
I really did not know that you could actually tell the state that somebody came from their last name, which is surprising if you think about it. And but I couldn't tell because I had friends who were from all over the place, including, we had Jewish people in my school. We had Hindu, Muslim, Sikh,
Mm. Mm.
Isai, everything, right?
Nice,
So we really
nice.
had the entire spectrum. I think that was a very um, in retrospect, I think it was very enriching to
enriching.
come from that.
Wonderful. So this is one aspect which is very important because this kind of coming together of various different cultures, and inherently a child would not even kind of feel that they are in a single kind of monolithic culture. This has deep impression in Indian psyche, right? And this probably sometimes even unconsciously gets embedded in one's mind, uh, which also means that this kind of open way of looking at the world, not just only from a cultural viewpoint, even in science is very critical. But do you see there is some kind of connection between these kind of upbringings and the kind of research problems, let's say, one takes up in future? It is kind of a far-fetched connection to make, but I'm just curious to see whether there is a cultural and kind of psychological connection to the scientific problems, because as we'll come to your own research, you made some very interesting connections from what is supposed to be a molecular phenomena to our uh, everyday life, so to speak. I just want to know about this.
So I wouldn't restrict it to science, but if you think about research as a whole, the whole idea of research is to search for something deeper. I think openness is a big part of research. I don't think you can do good research unless you're open, right? So if you go into research knowing the answer to the problem you're trying to solve, that's not research, right? That's just a sham, right? So research means you ask questions. It doesn't mean you do not have opinions, or you're not guided by what you've learned in your textbooks as to what the answer might be, but it's to be open to the fact that that could be wrong. And that oftentimes is the most interesting part of doing science, is to look at something thinking, oh, this is what it should be, and experiments tell you otherwise, and so
Otherwise,
nature cannot be second guessed. So I think growing up in a culture that allows you to see that there are different points of view, maybe there is a connection to that, and being open. And I think being open is very important to doing good research. So maybe, I don't know, maybe there is a connection.
fabulous, fabulous. So, Mumbai, paint us a picture. What kind of upbringing was it, both at home and outside? Because anybody who has lived there has very deep nostalgia. It almost is the point of envy for other people. Of course, there are other things also. For example, I grew up in Bangalore, and I have my own memories of that kind. But almost everybody who is born and brought up in Mumbai has very deep kind of nostalgic connection, especially if they've come out of Mumbai.
True. Honestly, so when I never imagined that I would actually spend many years in a city outside of Mumbai.
Mm.
So you're aware that from 2001 to 2019 I was in Pune.
Pune, yes,
uh,
yes,
and now that you mention sort of the fondness of a person for the city that they're from, I haven't seen it more deeply than in Pune.
yes.
Right? You can take a Punekar out of Pune, you cannot take Pune out of a Punekar, right? And I don't think, I mean, yes, Mumbaikars love the city, but I don't think it's quite the same thing.
Same.
Bombay is a demanding city,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, so I grew up in Mumbai, and like I said, I had family all over Mumbai. Even today, there is, I think, no suburb in Mumbai where I will not find a bed to sleep in. I mean, I have family everywhere in Mumbai.
Wow, is it okay? Okay,
Yeah, so my family moved to Mumbai. Both mother and father's side of the family, we
okay,
have
okay.
we have people all over the city. Um, but yeah, so growing up in Mumbai, I was very fond of the city, right? And this is the strange thing: you get a sense that you look at, let's say, Mumbai or Delhi or New York or Los Angeles, and you think that these are these gigantic cities and they are lifeless, right? So they have no heart,
Mm,
right?
mm.
But that's not true, because you grow up in Mumbai, you grow up in Chembur, and in my area, I knew everybody. It was like a small village, and I think especially if you're from Bangalore, you can sort of relate to that.
Yeah,
You break out into these smaller subsections of
subsection.
the city which you're most familiar with, but then you can also sort of commute to these other places. So I went to school very walking distance from my parents' house, but then we had this thing of a junior college, so
Mm,
11th and
mm.
12th
Yeah,
after
yeah.
10th, and there I had to travel a little
Travel.
bit. That was closer to where my grandparents, I mean my grandmother, lived. So my maternal grandmother used to live there. So in that sense, you have this sense of a city. It's fun because you can actually travel far enough and do a few things. At that time, there was a lot of things that were happening in the south of Bombay, right? So if you wanted to overwatch a movie in a nice theater, you'd go to the south of Bombay. You don't need to do that anymore. I'm glad you don't, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But that was the kind of thing, right? Then and maybe we were, maybe our parents were more willing to let us take chances. So I remember growing up that one of the things we would do, especially when we were slightly older, is over the weekend just cycle to Vashi.
Uh, uh,
So I lived in Chembur. Vashi is not very far, but it's also not that close. And there were no cell phones,
uh,
right? There was one occasion where my cycle got a flat and I had to wheel it back. It took forever. I'm sure my parents were worried, but I can't think about doing that with my kids today,
yeah,
right?
true, true. That is
So growing
something.
up, very typical. So let me also say that I came from privilege, right? I
Mm,
came from a relatively comfortable
mm,
background, unlike a large part of our country.
yeah.
And so I grew up in a middle class privileged background. I did all the things that you could imagine doing in most reasonable sized
Size
cities in
cities.
the country. Nothing very different. We had one channel that we watch everywhere across the country. We all watch Doordarshan. In a sense, maybe the TV shows were what bound us, because that's what all of us saw across the country. Now it is, I guess, Korean shows, but
That's a good one. We'll come to that point. That's
so
a nice kind of
so
viewpoint. Yeah.
yeah, so very very normal in that sense upbringing in Chembur.
Fabulous,
Yeah.
fabulous. So, was there any inclination towards chemistry or physical sciences then, or was that something still nascent?
I don't think
Mm,
per se, right? I mean, that was also the time when if you did well in
mm,
school and did well in academics, they expected you to do science,
mm,
right? Um, and the group that I hung out with, we were, a group of about five or six of us. We were very close. We, grew up together, went to the same school. In fact, one of them was also my roommate at IIT. I mean, the guy in the
mm,
next room to mine. So we sort of stayed together and did the same things. Went to the same colleges. We Most of us went to IIT Bombay. So um, I guess it was just the overall societal pressure on people, and then my peer pressure, because I just did what my other friends did. So I like science. I enjoyed it, but I equally enjoyed language, and I
mm.
equally enjoyed history, and even now, right? I mean, there's nothing I like better than to just curl up with a book and read. Right? I just love doing that, and I mean, I guess I'm lazy in that sense, but I like doing that a lot.
Absolutely. In fact, that's probably one of the most pleasurous activity one can ever have, especially on a day like this where we are expecting rains to arrive very soon. The reading habit, did you have that at a very early age?
Yeah, growing up, we always had books at
Mm,
home, or we had access to books.
mm,
We had, like I said, I came from a relatively privileged
mm,
background. My school had a nice library.
mm,
It was also, I mean, we also had memberships in local libraries. Actually, it's strange. I don't think people realize, but there used to be municipal libraries. So you could go to
mm,
the M Ward office library, which was in the municipal building. And the only reason I would go there is for the books. And they had an amazing collection, right? And so we would do this a lot. And so we always had books. And not so much TV, I guess, right?
absolutely,
Because you just didn't
absolutely.
have much choice. And so I grew up learning, enjoying, I mean, spending my time reading. And so yeah, I think I grew up with the reading habit.
See, you mentioned about the municipal library. Uh, in fact, in my own life, also, a municipal library has been very central, especially while growing up. And this is very true of a lot of people where still the mobile phones were not there. And even today, I don't know what is the current situation, but the at least in 90s or even maybe late 80s and towards even early 2000s, a municipal library in any city actually had probably one of the very biggest collections of resource for people to go and study. Uh, do you think that is still the case, or do you think that a lot of things, of course, have gone online, accessibility has changed, which is both positive, and I'm just trying to figure out some negative here.
So I don't know that municipal libraries
Uh,
exist.
uh,
I mean, they probably do, but it's expensive to maintain a
yeah, yeah.
library. There's real estate and also the cost of maintaining books and inventory. So I don't know, right? I
Mm,
have honestly not looked, because we've had access to other libraries and other. I mean, I have my own set of books at
yeah,
home
yeah,
now.
yeah.
But to your question of how things have changed, yes, the internet has changed things in a way that it's easier to have access. Data is remarkably cheap in
Yeah,
India.
yeah.
Everybody has access to data, so I don't think that is the limiting point. But I don't think that there is a reading habit anymore. Maybe some people who used to read have switched to audiobooks
Yeah.
when they drive and they walk. But if you look at the current generation, I really don't see that they have the attention span. And part of that is also, when you're talking about communication, for us, communication was sitting down, reading a book, and maybe taking the time to understand and regurgitate it, and maybe really sort of get into that and interpret it. But today, communication takes many forms, right? And that is true for scientific communication as well. Podcasts, for
Yes,
example,
yes, yeah,
didn't exist in our time,
yeah,
right?
absolutely, absolutely.
But uh, there's also going to be maybe a small number of people who will listen to a 90-minute podcast, right? What they
Yes.
will more likely listen to is a succinct version
Version.
which distills the essence of whatever they want to learn, or
Absolutely.
not learn, right? Or just
Yeah.
enjoy
Yeah.
or pastime, right? So if you think about it, video, audio as a means of communication, and the fact that you can take these data parcels and for such a low price
Price.
get it to people, has meant that the way people communicate, the way people absorb information has become very different. So the reading habit, I think, is not. I mean, I would hate to see it go away, but my sense is that is probably the case. So if
Yeah.
I, for example, if I have a problem that I pose to my students saying, oh, there's this method, just go figure it out and write a small piece of code or something. So what they would do is not go back and read the book that had the primary literature. They would probably go view a YouTube video. I mean, not probably, they will go view a YouTube video. They look for a YouTube video, and likely they will find a YouTube video, and likely that will do an outstanding job
Job.
of,
Yeah.
of communicating those ideas. And so, the way in which we obtain information has changed in a format that is maybe a lot more user friendly. I don't know, right? I mean, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Does that mean that you're passive and you don't have the time to absorb? But maybe reading was passive as well. I'm not sure, right? So maybe
No,
it's just different.
this is actually a fascinating kind of a topic. I think the final word is yet to be spelt on this. But if you observe one aspect which has drastically changed is the premium on information
Mhm.
has reduced a lot. Second is also the burden of committing things to memory has also been reduced drastically, which actually in a way, and some people have also spoken about it and have read a little bit about it, where the problem is that since you can now detach your mind from the information storage, uh, then the question will always remain that what will you really think about, because at the end of the day, if you want to do some creative things, you will still have to have two matrices still present in your mind. That matrices bringing together, of course, can come from outside, but many a times, as you know, if you're going for a walk or a run or doing some chores, suddenly you feel connection between two things. Like even Henry Poincaré, who
Yeah.
is one of the celebrated mathematician, used to tell that that intuition development comes from, or rather is followed by a very deep kind of commitment to learn something. My only kind of issue is that such kind of platforms such as video and audio will surely be not helping you to probably help you commit that information very very strongly. It can surely aid something. Reading still probably has very strong implication on imagination, right? Because for example, if you look at videos, video will actually assist you to visualize immediately. So sometimes it's great, as you mentioned, you can really jump into the topic, but sometimes you may actually have a different movie in your mind. This happens a lot with people who read even novels.
Mhm.
You would probably relate to that, because two people who have read the same novel would actually view things in slightly different way in a
Right.
sense.
And the question is, if that is true, so that's what I said, it's passive in a sense, because when you're viewing a video, you're being told how to maybe to visualize it. But do you process it? And is that different for this generation versus us? I'm not sure.
Yeah, yeah,
Right? Maybe
sure.
they look at this and they process it, or maybe they view different videos and they process them differently and then synthesize that somehow. So I think absolutely, to come up with something new, you have to ask original questions, and
Questions.
the start there point there is oftentimes some
Some
knowledge.
knowledge. Yeah.
But how detailed or how
Mm.
information rich does that knowledge have to be versus concept rich? And I don't know the answer to that.
Absolutely, it's a very fascinating. In fact, I know you also have deeply thought about education. We got to touch upon that, but it's also one more point related to this discussion is that there is also an element of storytelling. If you look at our own children books nowadays, I am astonished to see mathematics textbooks which have so very nice way of introducing a topic with some stories. For us, no way it was that kind of a pathway, because there you can see that they have understood, at least people who are really designing these things have understood that the humans do respond to stories, and what is a life without the story? Like Pratidwani itself is on the similar kind of theme. That is one thing also I see a very big change, where there is a strong element of storytelling which has come in. And if you look at even very big mathematics YouTube channels and all, they are now really trying to bring it's a very creative process. It's not an easy thing. Sometimes it's easy to just write an integral,
Yeah.
right?
And I think that should inform the way we teach as well, right? Because one of the things with so much information being available, and let's say NPTEL
Mm,
or edX and
mm,
so on being available, the question is, what is our role
mm,
as academics? And there's research, but there's teaching is a very big part of what we do. um, I think telling your own stories, right, is very important.
uh,
So, what is it that you at ICER Pune or I at
mm,
IIT Bombay can do when we have these really bright students who come to our classes? Is to tell them, when you teach this stuff. I mean, of course, you can just write down the integral, and for some students and for some of us,
mm.
it's easier to actually relate to that
Related,
because
yeah.
we can see through the mathematics. We've done it enough. But for a lot of others, I think introducing it in a way that tells them how it sort of makes sense to them, right? And that's through these stories, right? This is through where what the consequence of this is, where it came from, maybe sometimes the history
Mm,
of this.
mm.
um, and I think that's very important because that brings us, like Pratithwani, it brings science to life.
Right.
Uh, and also makes things more interesting and makes it relatable and gives them a context to which in which those problems are solved. I'm going to teach thermodynamics next semester,
Mm.
right? And yeah, I think most people have nightmare memories of thermodynamics. So it's for me, I think it's going to be important for me to try and sort of weave all these ideas together. I mean, the fact that thermodynamics came out of trying to make a better steam
Steam
engine,
engine, absolutely.
right? And to today looking at information theory and how concepts of entropy inform that. I think that's the story I want them to tell because these are bright students, right? They can go figure it out and watch a YouTube video, probably do a better job of explaining some of that
Yes.
than I can. But when I bring that in to tell them about the kind of problems that I'm working on and how that informs it, hopefully that would be the thing that would excite them, and that
Exciting.
would be the differentiator. And that, I mean, hoping that that's going to be what we have to
Absolutely.
do going ahead.
This is fascinating since you're mentioning thermodynamics, because I also have been reading a little bit for some one of the something I wanted to write about the history of steam engines,
Mm-hmm.
because you can see that there are few people who have participated in this. For example, Newcomen, Watt, and Sadi Carnot.
Mm-hmm.
That lineage is very fascinating.
Yeah.
And since you also just mentioned about the teaching part of it, the every step there actually is a very important question in engineering. And you can see it all kind of connects to the second law of thermodynamics, where it deeply connects to entropy and universe, etc. This jugalbandi of that science and technology is also beautifully illustrated in that topic. We'll come to that teaching part of it, because I
Mm-hmm.
know you're a very passionate teacher, and I have also seen so many of your talks and also interactions with students. But I also want to know that impression what you had from the schooling. What is the kind of broad pictures and lessons you extracted from schooling? Because I know it's a different era, but this is also a kind of oral history project in whatever small way it is. I wanted to just get an idea of what kind of education you went through, because we want to really get into your mind to know how you became a scientist at the end of the day. That question would be important for us now.
I think then, and maybe even more so now, schooling was about getting marks and doing well in the exams. In our time, the board exams were like a big deal, and my school had a record of having very very good results
Results.
in our board exams. So so the whole thing was around that, and especially if you did well in school, um, you know the idea. So unfortunately I don't think creativity comes from some of those things, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Doing well in a board exam means nothing, right? And it doesn't tell you anything about creativity. It doesn't tell you anything about doing good research or being a good scientist or being able to think creatively. It speaks to your capacity for hard work, and so I'm not surprised that people who did well in those exams continue to do well,
Yeah.
because I think hard work is an incredibly
Incredible.
important aspect of success in anything that you do. So some people started working hard, then continued to do well. Other people figured out later on that you have to work hard, and then did well, right? So it doesn't matter. But I don't think it was that so much. I like I said, I grew up in Chembur, very close to BRC,
Okay.
and so a
Okay.
lot of people that I went to school with had connections to BRC. Their parents were at BRC or things like that. So you had an exposure to people who had careers in science and technology. Um, the whole room temperature
Hmm.
superconductivity
Hmm.
crisis in the mid '80s. I knew people who were involved in thinking about it, doing experiments
Hmm.
about in those sorts of things. So it was interesting because you sort of connected. But like I said, I came from a family that didn't really do a lot of science. I mean, they didn't have a background in science per se,
Hmm. Hmm.
and so this was really very superficial.
Supervision. Okay.
But at least you're sort of exposed to that, and at that point, the idea was that you had to study well, you had to study hard. You did well. If you did well, then you go to these colleges, and if you
Hmm.
do well, then you go to med school or IIT. I mean,
Yeah.
that was it, right? And so I don't think a lot of thought went into that. I did well academically. Like I said, I would have loved to do language as well,
Hmm.
but I
Hmm.
did well. I got pushed to doing science.
Hmm.
I was not unhappy.
Unhappy.
I was
Okay.
quite happy with doing science, and so I guess it's just a series of coincidences that I ended up doing what I am. I could easily have been doing something else, and probably still would have been pretty happy doing
Happy
it.
to. Yeah.
But yeah, no complaints. I'm very happy with where I'm at. I think at some point you make conscious decisions, but that comes much later,
Later.
and when
Yeah.
you're sort of a little more deeply embedded
Yeah, but-
in the system.
So this also means that there was no pressure on you to really choose anything, or generally there would be some kind of a background, kind of peer pressure, or many a times even parental pressure.
Yeah.
You had something of
So
that
I had
kind?
zero parental pressure.
Great.
So my parents were perfectly happy with
Hmm.
any choice I made. So I was very lucky in that
Hmm.
sense. They were very far thinking in
Hmm.
that way.
Hmm.
It's like, okay, you're doing well. Do what you like.
Hmm.
I'm sure you'll be fine. And again, I think that comes from that privilege, right?
Hmm.
You come from sort of a reasonably well-to-do middle class
Yeah.
family. It's like, okay, you'll do fine. Um, there was peer pressure in the sense that I wouldn't say peer pressure as much as everybody in my group of friends was doing this, and so I did this.
Did
It was
this.
just more herd rather
Uh,
than peer pressure,
pressure.
I think.
Oh, so also was there any inclination towards the kind of subjects what you were already getting interested in, or you still had some kind of a direction but nothing specific?
So I did not like rote learning, right?
Hmm, hmm.
And that was for sure. So even in say languages where you had to sort of learn some lesson and regurgitate it. I hated that.
Hmm.
I liked being creative, and at least in my school you could, and they didn't penalize you for it. By the way, my grades in my board exams in languages were terrible, right? But in school I did really really
Right.
well,
Okay.
and
Okay.
but the point is, even in the sciences, so I got into med school, right?
Uh, oh,
And
you did get into med
I
school?
got into
Oh,
med school, right?
okay.
So I had a choice of going to IIT Bombay or going to medical school.
That's unusual, Guru, because many people, of course, whomsoever is getting into IIT would probably do everything at the cost of going into going to any other thing,
In
right?
those days it
Yeah.
was not so, because
Uh,
you had to take either physics, chemistry, maths, and computer
mm,
science or economics or bio. And I took bio because I
mm,
liked it at that point as well. But one of the things I figured is, um, India doesn't have a huge tradition of medical
Mm,
research even
mm,
today,
yeah,
right? And then when you went into medicine, it meant the practice of medicine,
yeah,
right? So
you're
being a
right,
doctor,
doctor. Yeah,
um, and yeah, of course, there's a lot out there, right? There's a lot to learn about the human body. It continues to be mysterious, and we understand so little about it. But that is not the way you looked at it, when you're going to get into med school at that point, right? Because you're talking about essentially being a doctor who learns a body of knowledge and then uses that to
yeah.
diagnose. And I didn't feel that that was what I'd enjoy doing. I thought that I would much rather like doing more math and
Mm,
physics, and so that's sort of what led me to take up engineering. But that was, yeah, sort of a conscious decision at that point.
okay.
I don't think it was very well thought through.
Mm.
I don't think I understood anything deeply, or that I understand anything deeply now. But
Yeah,
the point is, at that point, it was just sort of saying, oh, I'll do that. And a lot of the friends that I hung out with also did engineering,
engineering.
so kind of made sense. Yeah.
Yeah, but you're actually talking as though it's very easy to walk into engineering where you did engineering. It is actually not a very easy thing to really get into, because the JEE exam is, as everybody knows, one of the toughest examinations by design, or by by kind of the way it has been actually set up. How was your inclination, and what was it that took you to IIT Bombay? uh, just paint us a picture, because for a person like you who is unusually very well read, and also very open minded, knowing you also for many years now, I can see that you are not a person who is going to be pushing too much to really get only academic grades and things like that. There is some requirement of such kind of preparation for getting into these examinations. So how was that phase grew for you?
Stressful,
Stressful.
because preparing for the JEE is stressful. It's, I think, maybe far more stressful today. But even in those times, because you sort of committed to saying, "Oh, I want to do this," then you
Mm.
have to spend a couple of years. So those were times when you would get this material in the post,
Post.
right? So you get this voluminous tomes of densely, distilled down physics, chemistry, and mathematics. And to be honest, I was terrible. I'm not very responsible now, and I was not responsible then. So I'd get this stuff and I'd just pick up a novel and read it instead, right? So it piled up. Luckily, the peer group I was with was very focused on some of these things, and I would sort of study with them some part, and then I would sort of go back and do my own things as well. Yeah, so I don't think, I mean, it was stressful because I think I was so casual about the whole thing. But sometimes it is, if you're, I think that's a big difference, right? Today, I don't think that attitude would work, because the competition, the number of people vying for those seats is very large, and you have to be super well prepared. And I think it's sad because you're losing a lot
Yeah,
of time
time.
when you're in your formative years, when you're a child. You're not reading, you're not playing, you're just doing this stuff. That's terrible. I think that balance is important. Um, I had too much of the balance the other way, I think, but it was fine, because if you were reasonably well prepared conceptually, and even though you had not sort of actually gone through all the material that Agarwal and Brilliant sent you, you could still go in and have a reasonable shot of doing okay. I mean, you would not be, right at the top unless you were on a different plane altogether, but you could go in and still get through.
Get okay.
And so, yeah, I just got through, I guess, in that sense.
So talks through about that transition, because going into IIT itself is a very kind of transformative process. Either you're a student, or even sometimes a faculty, and generally speaking, I've heard that there is always a great kind of exposure related to that transition. Given that you were already growing up in Mumbai, probably from Chembur to Powai also was some kind of a small change. Just paint us a picture of that.
Yeah, so the IITs were very different in my day than they are today, for many different reasons. And uh, if you want to get into that, we'll talk about that separately. So it was amazing, right? So the classes were small. My entire incoming class was about 300.
Mm.
And for the most part, IITs were small institutions in that sense. The entire intake would be of the order of 1200 to 1500, and there were only five IITs at that point. So there was all, there was that sense of it being a little exclusive, but also the fact that you have this beautiful campus in the middle of the city. And in those days, Powai was remote, right?
Yeah.
I find it amazing when I tell students today that if you could go down and watch a late night movie in Kanjurmarg, it would be scary to walk back to campus because the road was deserted. And last week when I was going back to Mumbai, 11 o'clock JBLR was jammed, right? And it's just the change is tremendous in terms of the way the city has grown, and also the area around Powai has changed. So it was amazing. And uh, for the most part, these colleges were sort of local in the sense that if I looked at my incoming class, there are a lot of people from Mumbai and from Maharashtra.
Oh, is it?
Yes,
That's
and I don't
unusual,
think
right?
right,
Generally.
and I think that was sort of the case that you wouldn't have somebody from, it would be unusual from somebody from Delhi to choose to go to IIT
I did.
Madras rather than go to IIT Delhi. So in my class specifically, there were a lot of people from Mumbai, and in a sense, you'd sort of seen these same people in colleges and so on. So it was not that
That
daunting.
correct.
The academic environment was daunting, right? Because they force you to think, they force you to look at concepts. I remember the first ever exam that I took in IIT was my physics mid semester exam, right? So we all walk into this class. Um, and 15 minutes into the paper, these are, the entire incoming class of IIT Bombay. 15 minutes into the paper, we're all looking up and smiling because none of us was getting anything. And people have, this is the kind of stuff that makes memories, right? I'm on a very active IIT WhatsApp group in Pune, and the amount of time people talk about the trauma of physics 3 and maths 3 and so on,
It still remains.
still remains, right? And in a sense, they were pushing you, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the idea of going to a college and taking some of these advanced courses is not necessarily that everything that she's going to be useful. So, I mean, when people tell me I'm doing all these courses, and for example, at ICER, you have mandated that people have to do at least the introductory courses in all the
Courses. Yeah.
disciplines. And I'm sure kids ask you, why are we doing this stuff? I'm never going to do geoscience. Why am I as a mathematician doing geoscience? I think the point of college is to expand your boundaries. It's not just about learning what's useful. You go watch a YouTube video if you want to do that, right? But to go to college is to expand your boundaries and to push you, right? And that's true for graduate school. You do some classes just because they're hard, right? Because it teaches you how to push your brain, to push you to think about solving some of these things. So I think to some extent, it was like trial by fire with some of these courses, and those are the times when a third to a half of a class would fail physics
Yes.
2 and physics 1 and physics 2, and that was fine, right? Because you sort of learn to cope with that and do it. I think nobody could face that kind of adversity where they fail a course today. I mean, these a lot of the students I see are just not equipped to, I think, handle that after all the glory of getting into IIT Bombay after the JE and so on. So things have changed. So how was it? The city was not formidable. I had friends who came from, you start classes in last week of July, first week of August. That has not changed even today. And imagine you're coming from Rajasthan, Kota, Rajasthan. You arrive in Mumbai in July. It's like it's raining like you've never seen
See,
before.
that too from Rajasthan.
So I have friends who've done that. One of whom actually lives on the NCL campus today.
Okay.
And this is it's so I didn't have to face that kind of a change. But for a lot of people, it was the first time they really had complete freedom, right? Because you're living in a hostel, you're by yourself. Um, those were days when sort of the induction to the hostel could be sort of daunting, but it was fun because you made deep, lasting friendships, right? And so our hostels were mixed in the sense that you have people from all different branches, all different years. That's not the case today, and that's one of the big changes that has come in the student body today. Is that the hostels are now really, they have a first year hostel, and they do get
is it?
mixed up a little bit later.
Okay.
But by and large, the people whom you room with will probably be from your branch, which was not the case. And so
Even
for us,
branch.
even the
I
branch,
thought it's only the year. No.
year and branch, so your local wing might be.
Oh, okay.
So I could go to the mess, and there would be an electrical engineer talking about how exciting it was that you could do lithography at a few microns. At that point, that was exciting, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
can do much better today now. But um, where would you get to hear stuff like that, right? And again, people from very different backgrounds with very different outlooks on uh, on life. So it was a wonderful experience. I did a lot of things in IIT outside of academics. I think that was very rich
Which
experience for
is,
me.
see, you also mentioned about a specific topic related to the education itself, of getting exposed to something which you might not use. And you also mentioned about this kind of, let's say you take geoscience and other things.
Sure.
uh, this is a point which is of very high importance, of looking at some aspects which you may not find it of immediate use to your own curriculum, your own, let's say, courses, or even your own career path, what you would have thought as important. But most of the time, those happy accidents are the way you probably stumble upon something new. And is there enough room in our education system to foster this? See, I understand a lot of students who now are taking up courses have reasonably good understanding and also background in what they want to study. Probably they have also got very good exposure, as we just kind of discussed, due to so many interesting resources and information. But this exposure of something which you may actually be not totally interested in, but it is very important for you to probably connect it for a future thing, or it might find a new connection, and which actually also fosters creativity. Do you have any thought process, because you did mention that point,
Yeah.
which is, I think, very important. And you also are on Senate of ISET Pune, because I know that's you have been actually very close to the institution, where you've also given a lot of important input right from its inception, which means also that you have been very very closely associated with a lot of other groups, for exciting science group and other things. This kind of exposure of a slightly more liberal education is very valuable. Having also not only been a student but also somebody who is deeply embedded in such kind of activities, what is your thought process and what do you think about this thing?
Right. So I think students' academic choices today are shaped to some extent by employment opportunities, right? And this is especially true when you look at an engineering institution. What they're going to say is, how is this relevant to this job that I really would like to do in a couple of years? And my sense is, um, I think there's sort of the technical aspects of a job, right? And so you need someone who's well trained to do X, but that's, I think, not the same as saying that long term I want to be successful, because success cannot just come from learning how to tighten bolt A on nut B in a very efficient manner. I think some of it will come from asking the question: do I need to have bolt A and nut B? Can I just change it with, and you put in a rivet? I mean,
Mm.
completely strange kind of example. But the point I'm trying to make is to think outside of the box is where you need to be creative. And I think to be truly successful, you need to be creative.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
creativity does not come from very, of course, you when you're working in a given domain, you need to have deep domain knowledge, and that comes from working in an area. But if that comes at the expense of not knowing anything else, I think progress will be stymied, right? You will only go in a particular direction, you will not be able to consider other alternatives. um, so uh, you know I've heard this story about, for example, um, candle wax, and how candle wax used to be the way in which you make lighting. Are you in the business of candle wax or in the business of lighting, right? Because if you are going to be in the business of lighting and you switch from candle wax to, say, the just the a regular light
Mm.
bulb,
Mm.
right? uh, Candle wax is probably not going to have the same future. So I think that's the point you have to sort of look at is, can you start thinking about
Just
disruptive changes, right? And I don't think somebody who's very focused on very narrowly focused can appreciate disruptive changes or even see them coming. And going ahead, I think that's going to be very
very
important. And so,
important. Yeah.
I think there's a need for people who can be who can do some, a specific job, but there's also a need for you to be trained more widely. And I think universities need to train students more widely. You're not training someone to be very narrow, because then they're not going to be adaptable to change, right? So you're training somebody, so somebody who graduates from let's say IISER Pune or
Mm,
IIT
mm,
Bombay is 20, little over
mm.
20 when they graduate. They're going to be working 40 years,
Yes.
right? Look back 40 years and you tell me how the world has changed, and
Mm,
how would an education that were completely focused on teaching you how to be very efficient only in that narrow 40 year
mm.
old ago technology help you today? It won't, right?
Absolutely,
So
absolutely.
what's important is for you to learn, bits and pieces of everything that helps you think, that helps you make those connections. It doesn't only have to be research, right? I mean, I think in general, if you want to be competitive, if you want to be somebody who can adapt with the way times evolve, I think that's important. I think what's happening is, smart people will learn how to do that by themselves, and they'll do that maybe outside of the system. But really, that's our job as a university. When you have people who come in, yes, I want to train the best chemical engineers, but I want to train them to be able to handle the transition from oil based, petrochemical
Mm,
based economies to green hydrogen
mm.
economies. And I don't think that's something we can do if you don't teach them to think innovatively.
Wonderful,
So
wonderful. This is actually very deeply connected to problem solving. In fact, since you were, as you were speaking, I was also thinking on that particular part, because if you look at the definition of problem solving, uh, it is actually to take a known solution and apply it to an unknown problem, or other way around too, where there is a known problem where there is no solution, where you may actually make a connection. And this exposure to an area which you might not have really even inclination sometimes may actually give you some interesting connections. This is also a, 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 a kind of point which is kind of reasonably fostered within the kind of ecosystem of IITs. You being now also a professor there, you would surely have even greater understanding, because you also were a student and a professor there. It's a kind of unique thing also there. But also, given that this kind of peer ecosystem is one of the reason why IITs actually have really done great, not only in terms of, let's say, encouraging people to become better researchers, and they have literally gone outside and solved problems in the society. uh, this is something which has been done in at a smaller scale, because we need, maybe 1000x times what is now happening. What do you think, having been a student, I'm just taking that particular viewpoint, what do you think is something which is very positive, which can be taken forward, which can be implemented, let's say, across, even in places where the resources are kind of limited? For example, there are so many engineering colleges. Everybody would want themselves to be associated something close to IIT, because that's a benchmark within the India. uh, Given that you have, literally the experience, what is your viewpoint on that?
I can't claim to have any wisdom
Yeah.
on this, right? But my sense is that what makes the IT special is the fact that, um, well, many different things. One, you have very creative students who come to these campuses and they push you, right? You
Mm.
can't walk into a class unprepared. They will let you know you're unprepared, right? So you have to be very, very careful. But I think it's also the fact that I'm not constrained to worry about, you know grades or marks. Or, I mean, as a faculty, right, as a student, of course, I do have to worry about it, but that will come from not necessarily just some sort of rote thing. I mean, I don't have a prescribed syllabus. I know what I'd like to cover, right? But there is no fixed way in which I have to do this, and that gives me as a faculty the opportunity to play around, to be creative with how I teach things. I don't think that flexibility exists in the wider system, because they have university exams, or they've got these effectively like board exams that we were talking about in the schools and colleges, right? So you're sort of constrained to some extent. Part of that is, I mean, with autonomy comes that responsibility, right? And you need to have a certain level of authority in terms of your own subject to be able
Absolutely.
to command that kind of an autonomy. And finding good people to man all these colleges is a challenge. I think we've not invested as much in having very high quality faculty, because at the end of it, your job is not to make sure that teach them a textbook. They can read that for themselves, right? There's not that much value you're adding, especially in this day and age when there are so many resources
Absolutely.
available.
Absolutely.
What is it that you're getting them to understand? What is it that you're getting them to take out of this? Um, can they actually look at um, a non-ideal situation, right, where you're getting data from a real experiment and understand errors, for example, right? Because it's not going to be exactly what you see in a theory in a textbook. Um, so even to make that connection that what you read as theory in textbooks is our best guess model for the real world is something which is a deeper concept that I don't think all our students appreciate, right?
Yes.
um,
Yes.
and I think where you have um, faculty or you have teachers who can take you past that is really the big
Big
difference,
difference.
right?
Absolutely.
So I think it's a combination of things. I think we need to get into college for the right reasons, because we want to improve our standard as a student or as faculty. We want to have students to come in a certain level and elevate them to the next level, rather than just worry about what marks are you going to get in an exam. So the whole marks focus thing, I think, is a
It's
killer,
killer.
right?
Absolutely.
It
Absolutely.
does not necessarily promote learning. It promotes whatever 21 questions kind of
Mm.
learning, and that's no good for anybody, in my opinion.
True. True. So, going into the chronology again, where you are now studying as a BTech undergrad in chemical engineering department. Why chemical engineering, and how was your experience?
So why did I pick to do chemical
Chemical
engineering?
engineering. Yeah.
So I actually didn't, right? So when I
Hmm.
joined IIT Bombay, I joined the material science department, and the end of my first year, I switched to chemical
Oh, is
engineering.
it?
I did.
Now you're doing both. Actually, you have been able to all throughout your career in that way.
Right, right. I mean, at the research level, anyway, I
Yeah.
think there are
Yeah.
boundaries
Everything.
are not really there. Why did I do that? I don't really know, right? I was in a hostel.
Mm.
The people I was rooming with mostly were chemical engineers.
Mm.
I grew up in Chembur, right? So I've
Yeah.
seen refinery flares growing up,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
BPCL was right next to home, HPCL was right next to home. If you took the bus from Bombay to from Chembur to Matunga, you would see the flares at that point when you would still flare off gases in these refineries. So I grew up surrounded by chemical industry in a sense. So and school trips, we would actually go to Tata Power Plant or RCF or some of these refineries. And so maybe that, and maybe the fact that I was surrounded by these other chemical engineering students was one of the reasons why I chose to switch to chemical engineering. Yeah, I don't think I knew enough to know what I was doing, but it's been a very enjoyable journey. I think uh, if I look at what chemical engineering offers, really there is no problem that a
Absolutely.
chemical engineer cannot approach today, right? I mean, every single thing that you're doing, whether it is people who are managing data centers for some of the big for Google and so on, because if you have servers, maintaining the efficiency of server requires incredibly good understanding of heat transport.
Yes.
And so whether it's something like that, to looking at refinery operations, looking at green hydrogen, to looking at problems with sustainability, right?
Yes. Yes.
How do materials impact the way people live, the environment? So it is almost in every discipline you find that chemical engineering gives you the balance of physics,
Physics and chemistry.
chemistry, and so you can sort of fit into or biology or mathematics, right? So you can sort of fit into any one of these problems. So it's unusual, right? In a chemical engineering department, we'll have faculty whom you could effectively classify as applied mathematicians, right? The guys who do
Absolutely.
fluid
Mm.
mechanics. I mean, the faculty who you could classify essentially as physicists,
Yes.
or catalysis guys are very close to chemistry. And now you have people in my department. I have colleagues who do systems
Mm.
biology, who
Mm.
do things like
Mm.
genome editing, and so it's really a discipline
Yeah.
that, in a sense, is still rooted in some basic principles, but has really spread very large. It's very, very, very far. As a chemical engineer, it's kind of scary because you don't know what the core is
Core.
sometimes, and this
Yeah.
is a worry for us as a discipline.
Yeah.
Your chemical engineering came out of largely chemistry and mechanical engineering departments,
Yes,
right?
yeah, yeah.
This marriage of the chemistry and
Chemistry.
mechanical engineering departments gave rise to chemical engineering. Now we have grown so huge as a discipline. The question is there a core?
Core. Yeah.
And you can see that in faculty meetings where um, PhD bare minimum requirements for coursework are debated, right? It's like, do I really need to have my students do math? Well, yes, you do. You're still getting a chemical engineering degree. So things like that. So it's interesting. It's a discipline in flux
Yeah,
continuously, and that's a good thing. I think it
absolutely.
keeps you alive.
See, 2 points I would want to mention. One is, my own introduction to soft matter is thanks to you and Prasad. You people actually organized a fantastic meeting on in IIT Bombay. By the way, quite some time ago, almost more than 10 years ago, maybe now, maybe less than 10 years ago, on nanoparticle assemblies and other things. It was a Faraday meeting, actually,
Yeah.
in that sense. And there, if you look at the people who attended that meeting, and subsequently my own education in soft matter physics, having read books and some papers and other things, if you see, almost everybody who has done some very fundamental work comes from chemical engineering background, and there is a deep connection to basic physics, and of course there is chemistry, and very very elegant engineering aspects related to material science. So many things actually come together. It is a very open kind of environment in which you are encouraged to get in and also contribute in that way. And second thing is, I kind of remember a lot of discussion happening, especially in NCL, because NCL also has a strong polymer science and chemistry. And Professor Sriram, whenever he talks, he tells chemistry is very utilitarian. That is something which is always at the back of one's mind. So this kind of broad element of engineering, uh, where it is open to even people who do science, is one of the uniqueness of chemical engineering. At least from an outsider perspective, that's what I find. The second point is that, is there enough number of people who see this way, is the question. Because again, as an outsider, having been a kind of a physics kind of perspective, I don't see a lot of enthusiasm for people who do engineering telling that I want to become a chemical engineer, right? Because the perception in Indian society, at least, is that you would be sitting in at a desk and working on a code. That is the perception generally. Computer science engineering is the highly sorted off. Subsequently, thereafter, there will be something else. Again, having been inside and also a kind of a professor and also a mentor for so many people, what is your perspective, Guru?
I think young people who want to decide on their careers should not be forced by societal pressures, right? I mean it's sort of an idealistic thing to say, and of course people will be, and to some extent that is driven by um, perceived employment opportunities. I think chemical engineering offers a lot,
Mm.
and it allows you to go into all sorts of different fields. Um, but even if I look at the undergraduate students who graduate from IIT Bombay, a large number of them, after finishing an undergraduate degree in chemical engineering, don't necessarily do chemical engineering jobs.
Uh, uh,
Now, I think that's a tremendous loss. It's a loss for industry because you're losing some of the brightest people, and I think we need to find a way of understanding where that loss is coming from and um, how to sort of make make attractive careers available to these students, right? These are smart students, right? They have learned enough chemical engineering, and these some of them will have very high GPA, so the
GBA, right?
opportunities are there for them to. I mean, so clearly they've learned their
Right.
chemical
Yeah.
engineering,
Yeah.
but they don't perceive necessarily that what they offer to in terms of what they offer to industry is appreciated as much as maybe in other sectors
Uh, uh,
where they might get paid a lot more. Uh, so so I think there is this perception issue, and as you grow in this ladder, one of the things I've seen, if I look back at my own graduating class of
Mm.
chemical of
Mm.
not necessarily chemical engineers but engineering as a whole, people have gone all over the place. Some people have come back into things which are more, I have people who uh, started off and got a degree in electrical engineering who then essentially run a chemical plant today, and
Wow.
things like that,
Nice.
right? So
Nice.
uh, yes, in a sense, I
Mm.
think the engineering science education that
Mm.
one gets in a place like IT allows you to do that. But chemical engineering itself offers creative people a lot, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
it offers
Absolutely.
tremendous growth because it allows you to sort of switch across and do all sorts of interesting things. But I think it's important to, if you want the brightest people and you're competing for that talent, then you have to be able to compete and recognize that
Mm.
talent, and make it worthwhile for those people to come and be part of it. So I think it's complicated. This is a more complicated story in terms of understanding how you maybe make internships available in industry.
Mm.
How do you
Mm.
excite people? How do you show them what is out there before they sort of get tracked
Tracked
into
into.
some one or the other things. If you're in chemical engineering, you can probably make a switch to something else. But if you've spent 5 years, I don't know, doing financial management, switching back to chemical engineering is
Yeah.
very hard. You might have a good enough appreciation, so you can sort of be part of the chemicals industry,
Mm.
and maybe make a contribution. But you cannot come back to core
Core
engineering in that
engineering.
sense.
Yeah.
So, um, how do you know? So maybe maybe chemical engineers need to be on social media more. Let's put it that way.
That's a good. Actually, not a bad idea. But generally, what is the perception currently, like among the students in IITs? Would they see it as an option which they are very enthusiastic to take? Or
So um, I don't. So when you look at the students who enter IITs, right, they spend 3 4 years. Places like IIT Bombay, they spend 3 4 years in these coaching institutions, and I think they've lost the ability to think,
think.
right? And so there's like, okay, here's somebody's given them a sort of a chart.
Yeah.
Now, where does that come from? It probably comes from some kind of collective wisdom,
Yeah.
and maybe that comes also from what the employment opportunities are. So if I'm going to do XYZ engineering, do I get a job doing that kind of
Mm.
engineering? Or while I'm doing chemical engineering, do I also have to take data sciences course to make sure I'm employable? It's a it's but that a lot of that collective wisdom does not necessarily uh, span time, in the sense that it's very often people who graduated and been out of engineering college for a few years who are passing this wisdom down, and I don't think there's um, sufficient time in that wisdom for them to
Yeah.
have made. The point I make with people from my class who graduated 25, actually now almost 30 years ago, is that people take your career will take all sort of nonlinear trajectories, and if you're trained well, you do well, right? Uh, One of the things I did when I joined IIT Bombay is I was talking to these students, and I like talking to undergraduates because I can sort of
Mm.
see where, sort of the predicament
Okay.
that
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
that I was in many years ago, and they're very confused and they're also very stressed. You'd imagine,
Mm.
you're a student at IIT Bombay, you shouldn't be stressed
Mm.
about what the future holds for you, but they are very, very stressed.
Mm. Mm.
And so one of the things I did is I got a panel put together of people from my class who graduated who are doing all sorts of things,
Mm. Mm.
completely all over the place, right? And they're all doing well,
Mm.
right? And I had them speak to the current students and had the students ask them questions. And now this has become a thing. So they call it time capsule. I've just now the
Mm.
students run it by themselves. Every year, the class that graduated 25 years ago comes back for a big reunion, right?
Wow. Nice. Nice.
And that happens as it's an
Mm.
ID tradition.
Yeah.
We call it the Silver Jubilee reunion.
Mm.
We have this every year, and so you now have this delta T equal to 25 years given to you every year, and the students will, each department has an alumni secretary who's a student. They'll talk to these class that graduates, get a bunch of them to form a panel and speak to them. This is done online. So typically the Silver Jubilee reunion happens at the end of December. So
Mm.
typically end of January, there'll be one every year. The idea is this: what is your journey? And we've had people who've become monks. We've had people who've become film directors. We've had people who are CEOs of company that run dating apps. I mean, you have the entire thing, and these are all successful people,
Successful people. Yeah.
right?
See, that is the beauty about a good education, right? Because at the end of the day, of course, you would want your students to become physicists. But having said that, we also have very kind of deep appreciation of the fact that what you learn is how to think, and how to really go ahead and use that knowledge in its own way, creative way one
Mm.
can do it. So now going, in the same timelines what we are now speaking, you're now finishing your BTech. What is your thought process, and are you really thinking about research or job or anything? What was the kind of thought process?
So I didn't apply for a job when I finished my BTech.
Were people surprised or not? Well, of course
See,
you would
if
have
you're
some
close to
opportunity.
the top of your class,
Hmm.
then and you are
Yeah.
fairly certain
Yeah.
you want to go to graduate school, the chances that you'll get to graduate school are very high.
You did well then in
I did
uh,
reasonably well
okay.
at IIT Bombay. I had a wonderful time, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
I was very active in the hostel and doing all kinds of
Hmm.
stuff which are completely non-academic. In my first year, I was the institute hockey secretary.
Wow.
So
Okay.
IIT was a fun time for me, and I wish this were true for everyone, that
Hmm.
people
Hmm.
really get to appreciate everything that the campus has to offer. Unfortunately, that's not true, right? A lot of people just about go through the system without really enjoying all of it. I was lucky. I got to enjoy all parts of the system. So when I graduated, I was doing really well, and I applied mostly only to top 10 schools in the US. And I was reasonably certain I would get it. And I got in a very early acceptance from I think Caltech was probably the first school that offered me a position. And it was a small school, similar at that point in time to the size of IIT Bombay. IIT Bombay had about 2,000 students. Caltech had about 2,000 students.
I have to pause
Today,
here and
yeah,
mention that Caltech is California Institute of Technology. Although he's saying that it is it was a small, it is one of the greatest, education system, part of a California education system, and it has given people like Feynman and so many greats, and it's also a great place to do not only science but technology. Yeah, please
right.
proceed. Yeah.
Yeah, so it was about the same size, and the difference is today IIT Bombay is 13,500 students, and Caltech is still 2,000 students, right? So,
Yeah, yeah.
uh, so it's maintained
Mm.
that culture, I guess, and that was a wonderful place, and so I wanted to go there. Also, I was not too keen on cold weather, so I wanted to be on the west
Bay.
coast. So it ticked many boxes for me. It had people that I really thought I would enjoy working with, and that was also true. And I
Mm,
sort
mm.
of went to Caltech. So I was very sure I wanted to go to graduate school, so I did not apply for a job when I graduated.
Okay.
And since I got an early acceptance, it was also quite easy for me to make up my mind that I want to do that. Now, when I was a student at IIT Bombay, we had to do a compulsory research project, a year-long
Mm,
research
mm,
project, and that taught me that I enjoy doing that.
mm,
I mean,
mm,
what I did then was some modeling. So
mm,
we did some simulations on a computer and some modeling when I was an undergrad. But it got me interested in the idea of research,
mm.
and trying to be able to use some of the things that we've learned to understand processes, materials, and so on. So that was sort of the thought process. I was very clear I wanted to do that. It was not unusual in my time
Mm,
to for
mm.
that to happen. So if you were in chemical engineering, I'm guessing 40, 45 out of the 60 of us who graduated probably went to the US right after we finished.
Wow. Okay.
That was very, very common.
Common. Yeah.
It is very uncommon today.
Is it?
Yeah,
Mm.
so out of a class of 160 that graduate, maybe five of them would even consider applying to graduate school. And they will only apply to graduate school if they're getting into the top 10. Otherwise, they won't even bother.
Is it?
Yeah,
I thought that these numbers were very large nowadays. No,
not from
no.
IIT Bombay, right?
Oh,
It's
wow.
interesting,
Mm,
it's as a sociological phenomenon. Well, many different ways of
mm,
looking at it. I think one, again, in 30 years
mm,
ago, if you were not from a big city and
mm.
privileged and came from a sort of an upper middle class background, you didn't get into an IIT, right?
Right. Yeah.
The knowledge was not there that IITs exist.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's completely changed.
Mm,
Not if all the negatives of the coaching industry
mm.
apart, they have democratized
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
process of
Yeah.
getting into an IT. So that you have to give to them. What that also means is you have people who might need to get a job when they graduate. So
I get
that's
it.
one part of it. The
Absolutely.
other is just a vote of confidence in the Indian economy,
Mm.
right? I mean, a lot of people who graduated with me and went to higher studies in the US did not go because they loved chemical engineering, wanted to do more of
Yeah.
it, right? A lot of times it was just a way of getting out of the system
System.
and going to a place which had more opportunities for
Mm,
growth.
mm.
And the fact that people don't want to do that today, to some extent, is just saying, why would I want to travel? I have opportunities here. There's growth here. And so I think different ways of looking at that. But so going back to my decision, it was very straightforward. I enjoyed doing that. Thought this was a great school. I thought I'd get to learn a lot. And so yeah, I found myself on a flight to California.
Fabulous, fabulous. Paint us the picture of your PhD kind of days. What was it like? What kind of work you did? Mm.
Right. So yes, I went to Caltech with you know now I say that you see all these students who come out of IIT and they're entitled. I think I was entitled then, right? So I went there thinking, what the hell, I'm going to do great, right? So I went in there and I joined a group, and my coursework was, I did very well at Caltech, right? So I had this fellowship that's given to one student from the incoming class in chemical engineering that
Yeah.
allows you, that basically gives you a continuous fellowship for your entire PhD. So I got that. It was called the Ralph Economy Prize, and
Mm.
so I got
Mm.
that when I joined, when I after my courses, and I did well. We had a qualifier. The qualifiers in chemical engineering in that year were particularly brutal.
Mm.
Only five out of 16 of us qualified. I was one of them, but um, at the end of it, I was thinking, oh, I learned a lot in my first year, but now I'm not learning enough.
Mm.
So I went to my advisor and say, I'm not learning enough. I want to quit my PhD. So I came back to India, look for a job in industry, and they said, why do you want to come here? But we'll give you a job anyway. You have a master's from Caltech and this. And then I thought, okay,
You had come back.
for a summer, thinking
Uh-huh.
I'm going to do this,
Uh,
and then I went back thinking I'll wind up and come
uh,
back. But my advisor said, "Listen, fine. Figure out whatever problem you want to work on, and let's work
mm.
on it."
Mm.
And it was just that the openness of
No,
that
but yeah,
system that
yeah,
allowed
yeah,
you to do
yeah.
that I really
Mm.
enjoyed. And so I chose sort of, I lived with my suitcases packed for for many months, but I really enjoyed
Mm.
working on some of those problems, and so then I decided I'd do a PhD. And by and large, it was it. Yeah, sure, I worked very hard, right? Because
Mm.
I had already spent 2 years working on a very different problem, same group,
Mm.
and my advisor was very generous. She said, you go pick a problem, and I'll find funding for you.
Nice, nice.
And so I did that, and then I switched to this other problem, which it was a interesting problem because I had to build equipment. And if you come from India and a place like
Mm.
IIT,
Mm.
you're very good in sort of theoretical
Theory,
knowledge, but you
yes.
can't build equipment. And that was amazing, right? Learning how to do that, learning to interface with the machine
Machines.
shop, the glass blowing guys, figuring out what is available in the market, because you don't want to sort of you want to take components that exist to build your equipment. So it was fun. So that was an interesting project. Was very well appreciated
Mm.
as well. So by the time I finished my PhD, I only had a couple of papers. Right,
Mm.
I mean, I had many in the pipeline, but I had this one paper on in review of scientific instruments on building the equipment, and one
Nice.
paper that came out of that. But that still allowed me to be nominated for. So I was on the finalists for the APS Best Thesis Award, called
Wow.
the Patent Prize,
Mm.
and the ACS Best Thesis Award, which was called at that point the Unilever Prize, I
Mm.
think.
Mm.
I didn't finally get selected for any of
Mm.
them, but I was in the top five for both of them. So by and large, it was a lot of hard work. Um, very very interesting experience, because even though you know you think you have a global outlook, when you actually go live in a place which is truly multicultural. My office mates were from all over the world. I had
Mm.
my the technician whom I worked with was from Venezuela. I had colleagues who were from Korea,
Mm.
from Japan, um, from China, of
Mm.
course. Yeah, and so students from all over the world. And it's fun, because you really understand what multicultural
Multicultural
means
means totally.
at that point. So yeah,
So,
so I had a great experience at Caltech. I really enjoyed the place. I'm very grateful I chose a small place, because I think I do well in
in
environments
this,
like that. Yeah, and very very so the people you get to interact with are very very smart,
smart. Yeah.
and they push you and they teach you why you should be humble. I think that
Absolutely. Oh, yeah.
that's an important lesson.
So, what was the kind of question you were addressing during your PhD? Just kind
So
of
my
in
first couple of years, I was looking at using block copolymers to pattern pattern silicon. This was not a problem that my group was working on. They worked on block copolymers, but not something like this. So I messed around with it for a while, and then I switched to looking at understanding how polymers crystallize, especially in flow fields. Uh, you'd imagine that this is a very common problem because semi-crystalline polymers are 70% of the 400 million tons of polymer we produce today. And so polyethylene and polypropylene are huge volume
Huge.
polymers. And if you think everything is known about it, it's not, right? Still very difficult problems. And they were difficult problems 30 years ago when I said 28 years ago when I started working on it. But we built equipment to allow us to do very controlled measurements. We also took the entire equipment, shipped it to the East Coast to the synchrotron facility and did experiments there. So really, I think pushing the edge of
Edge
what
of
we
the.
could do with those materials. But yeah, wonderful, very broad education in polymer physics, in chemical engineering, but in the department on polymer physics. One of the people who was on my thesis committee was a guy called Bob Grubbs, who was an outstanding polymer chemist and also won the Nobel in
Nobel Prize.
2005.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So, chemical engineering taught me to speak to chemists like Bob Grubbs, John Burkaw, outstanding catalysis chemists, saying, I need somebody to make these molecules for me. Speak to outstanding physicists. My advisor is somebody I have a lot of respect for, just for her sharpness, right? Her ability to take a problem and pull it apart. She's somebody I keep in touch with even today. She runs a company out of Pune, and so I get to see her.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Wow. What's
I
her
don't know.
name? Could you please?
Julie Cornfield. So absolutely outstanding scientist in my
So
opinion.
there's a company here in Pune. Yeah. What's the company name? Could you just
The
name it?
Yeah, so this is actually a project that was started by a postdoc when I was a student there, which is to look at intraocular lenses, right?
Nice.
And so the idea is, if you have a cataract surgery, you have to put a lens in, but that lens never exactly matches what curvature you need, and so at the end of the cataract, you have to wear glasses. And so the thing is, if for example, in a setting where, let's say, you cannot afford to change a pair of glasses, your glasses get broken, then effectively having the cataract still leaves you blind because you can't see without the
See,
glasses.
yeah, yeah.
So the idea here was to have a lens where you could change the focusing power after you implant it to give you precisely what you want. And so this is a company that they started, and there's a successful product that's already out in Europe. But she wanted to do it in the Indian market, and so we got to speaking. And she'd never visited India, despite having a lot of Indian students in her group. So they come visit me. Introduced her to the venture center in Premnath, and they found someone who could run the company. Happens to be a physicist from IIT Bombay, right?
Nice.
So yeah, so somebody with an engineering physics degree set up this company called Nayam, and I think they've done spectacularly. They're doing extremely well. They've been doing this for 10, 12 years. Very, very,
Very.
the company has done very well. And so the nice part, apart from this, is that I get to see her every now and then because
Right.
she comes to Pune for the board meetings and things like that.
Wonderful, wonderful. Wow, I did not know this,
Yeah,
Guru. This is fabulous kind of information. Also, uniqueness of Pune.
uniqueness
Which
of Pune.
not to boast about the city, but it's actually one of the melting pots in that way.
Right.
I agree. So, next transition. What were you thinking? You're finishing up your PhD. Were you
Right.
already thinking about a job or?
So, so I finished my PhD in 2000, and that was the time of the dot-com boom.
Boom. Yes.
It was also the time when things, so the technology industry was going through the roof, right? And a lot of that was driven by things like optical fiber becoming available. So just fact that you could port data using optical fibers, right? So any company with optical in the name, yeah. And so getting a job was easy. So I actually got offers when I was finishing my PhD, and I wanted to come back to India because I felt that this is where this is where my roots are. This is where I'd like to build my career. But I didn't want to come back making a compromise on what I could do professionally.
Yeah.
So I had visited Premnath, whom we spoke about. So Premnath and I go back so a long way. So Premnath was 2 years ahead of me at IIT Bombay, and he was the hockey secretary the year before I was hockey
Wow.
secretary.
Okay,
So
that's it.
that's the connection. So I actually know him because of the fact that we played together. We played sports for IIT Bombay together. And he had midway through his PhD, midway through his undergrad, done a project with Dr. Mashelkar, and so he knew NCL, and he went to MIT, finished his PhD at MIT, and he was, I think, impressed enough by NCL that he came back directly. And so when I was, so I ran into him, I think, in a bus when I was visiting in Bombay, and he said, "You come visit me in NCL, right?" And so I came here. I spent a couple of days, gave a talk at NCL, and I really loved the place. I loved the vibrancy. I loved the positive environment. I loved the fact that here was a place that at that point had started doing some of this work with GE. So there was funding, and they were
Yeah.
setting up labs, which were I saw equipment here which I thought I would be very happy being able to
Dream
use.
use it.
So it was nice labs. It was a very welcoming environment. It was competitive. It was something where you were doing work with industry. As an engineer, that's something which was important to me. They were advising government. They were doing really impressive fundamental research. I thought this is wonderful, right? This would be heaven. And so I was thinking about that, and then I came back again before I finished my PhD, and I came back and visited NCL, and I really loved the place. I remember, and that was a time when people like Ashish Lele and Premnath were doing a lot to try and attract
Okay.
people. So I remember when I was here, sitting in Ashish's backyard, and Iser wasn't there, but looking at this beautiful place and drinking tea and thinking, "Wow, this is not too bad."
Yeah.
And then they went beyond that, right? So NCL made me an offer before I finished and said you could come. Then I called up Sivaram and I wanted to chat with him on the phone before I came back. He's saying, "Why do you want to come? You spend a year doing a postdoc. You should broaden your horizons." So I was like, "I'm going to graduate. You're telling me now I should think about a postdoc. You made me an offer. I can come right away." He said, "No, no, go find a postdoc." So then I tell my advisor, "Listen, I want to find a postdoc, and I want to broaden my horizons. So why don't I go to Europe?" So she picks up the phone, and I get a call from somebody at the Max Planck saying, two different Max Planck saying, "Come, why don't you come do a postdoc with us?" So I thought, okay, why not? Let's go to Europe, spend a year there. So I went to the Max Planck for colloids and interfaces
Interfaces,
in Gulm,
yes.
um, which was also fascinating. It's in Brandenburg. So it's just outside Berlin. Brandenburg was in the former East Germany. Uh, yeah, so that's something people don't even remember now.
Yeah.
This is 10 years after reunification, right? So there's still the scars of reunification. Amazing place to be if you're a student of history.
History, yeah. Yeah.
And so I really enjoyed my time there. I spent a year at the Max Planck working for an Australian who ran a group which had Spanish people, German people, Indians, Chinese, Portuguese. I mean, it's fun, right? It was
Wonderful.
really amazing experience spending a year there. And then I came back to NCL, which I wanted to do
Do
anyways. And
anyway.
at that point, I said, "Oh yeah, sure, you can come back and join us."
See, Guru, this is a question I ask many people who generally appear on the kind of show. Uh, you did allude to that point and you also addressed it, but I want to stress a little bit on this. Why did you come back? Because, maybe 99 out of 100 people would really want to think. Uh, I asked this question not because to just stress upon your own journey, but there are a lot of people in India who have made this choice deliberately, in spite of the fact that maybe the opportunities, both economic and intellectual, can be much much broad. I would never say it would be better, much broader, because your avenues become very different there. But why is that? Why is that the question? That why did you really plan to come back?
Right. So when I graduated, I so like I said, it was the economy was booming. So I had an offer from a startup that was doing combinatorial materials, which I thought was very exciting. So that was one possibility I was looking at. But I also had this offer from NCL, and I had visited NCL and I'd seen the labs here. So I didn't think I was making a professional compromise. If it were, I would not have come back. So I mean, people from a previous generation who came back when they had to make a lot of sacrifices in terms of what they could do professionally, maybe I would not have been able to do that.
Hmm.
But by the time I came back, um, the economy had started liberalizing.
Mm, mm,
The government said, we believe that science is going to lead to technology, is going to lead to prosperity, and they were investing in science. And there were few institutes. So if you look at the per capita investment in in scientists at that point, it was quite good. Um, uh, so for me also, this was home, right? I
mm,
have
mm,
some family in the US,
mm.
but the majority of my family is here, and for me, I wanted to be back for
But
personal reasons. I would not have done it at the cost of
uh,
professional reasons,
uh,
but that worked out.
uh,
Also, in terms of just sort of, I mean, I come from a somewhat comfortable
mm,
background,
mm,
so for me, that equation was not very important. And like I said, it's privilege, right? I mean,
mm.
if I can afford to
Yeah.
do that because you know the finances were not
Were not
that
what.
important to
Yeah.
me at that point. For me, what was more important was to be at a place where I could make an impact,
Impact.
where I saw that I could do things that would be exciting and where I could make an impact. And so that was really the only reason that guided me to come back. And I spent 18, 19 years at NCL and I loved it.
Yeah.
Right?
So now you moved back to NCL, right?
To
After.
IIT Bombay.
Oh, you moved
Oh, you mean? Oh, you're saying?
after the
Oh,
post
right, right.
after the
Sure,
Germany
sure.
experience. Then you moved to NCL
Right.
directly. You took up that offer which was there.
Yes.
How was that transition?
Um, Interesting because um, you know, Caltech is not part of the University of California system. By the
Yeah,
way, just to
yeah.
correct what you said
Oh,
earlier,
yeah.
it's a
It's
private
a
college,
private. It's a private institution.
and so there is no bureaucracy. Or then
Mm,
there was no bureaucracy,
mm,
right? So you work in this environment which was really, they're focused on
mm,
maximizing your
mm, mm,
productivity, and
mm,
the Max Plancks are also
mm,
remarkably. I mean, not, Europe in general is bureaucratic, and the Max
mm,
Plancks
mm,
were as well, but not when it comes to your work and your group,
mm,
right? And so to come back from that to a national lab environment was challenging culturally, but the place was very supportive,
mm,
right? And I had people who were both colleagues, supportive colleagues, and very good personal friends. So Premnath,
mm,
Ashish were the two people who, for me, were like my safety net in that
mm,
sense, right?
mm,
So you go, there's something very frustrating administratively, and then you can just go and vent to them, and they're perfectly fine. They know what you're coming from, and sometimes they'll figure out a way
mm,
around it. And the leadership was very
mm,
supportive at that point. So at the point when I joined, Sivaram was my department head,
mm, mm,
and it was incredibly
mm.
supportive of a lot of things that I did. Just very open to saying, do what you want. We will support you. We want you to grow. That was an amazing environment, I think. And then shortly after that, he became director,
Mm.
but he was still accessible, and we could talk to him. And so, by and large, I think the transition was not too hard because I had the right group that cushioned me, sort of cocooned me from
Courtney.
some of these
So,
things. And I think that's very important, right? When we hire, very often it's the first time somebody is doing a job by themselves, in a sense. They've been a student or a postdoc. They've never really had to run a group. They don't have necessarily all the skills that you'd expect
mm,
a PI to have, learning how to manage administration, finances, uh, interpersonal relations when you have a group, all of that. And so having environments that you can so creating the environments which will nurture young assistant professors, for
mm,
example,
mm.
in our
Yeah,
environment is super
super
important,
important.
because
Absolutely.
I think if you don't do that, they're just going to get lost to all the frustrations of
Frustrations.
dealing
Yeah.
with the system. So protect people from the system is important. Let them get to a point where they can then deal with it, and then in turn, hopefully, they'll pass it on.
Pass it on. Wonderful. So you actually were already kind of thinking about research problems while coming back here, because there is quite a lot of interesting activities on polymer science in NCL, National Chemical Laboratory in Pune, and there is actually not one but many people who are interested in that and have very deep connection with industries. That is another fascinating aspect of NCL research. So, were you thinking about the kind of problems you're going to choose, or you kind of organically started new problems as you went along?
No. So at the point when I came back, there was no requirement to write a research proposal, but I did anyways because I wanted to do that for just the rigor of doing it. So I had ideas on things that I wanted to work on, some of which I didn't work on, right? Because they turned out to be complicated and they required resources which I did not have available to me, also in terms of collaborations and so on. So, but some of those problems I did pick up. Some of those I sort of knew the kind of problems that NCL was interested in. Understanding how polypropylene crystallizes when Reliance is building amongst the biggest
Biggest.
polypropylene facilities in the country, in the world, in fact, sorry, not the country, makes it very easy for you to then make those linkages as well. So I think that kind of I sort of knew what was available, what I could do. Built this group together. Me, Premnath, and Ashish built this what we call the complex fluids and polymer
Polymer
engineering
chain.
group
Yeah.
at that point. So I sort of knew what I wanted to work on, and it meshed nicely with what was going on. And then as your journey proceeds, you
Proceeds.
pick up other
Pick up.
problems with.
See, one very important factor which I found when I was doing also a bit of kind of brief research is that you have been very comfortable both in the academic environment and interfacing with the industries. Uh, Knowing you, it's not very surprising, but there is a lot of things to learn for anybody who wants to do that, because there is now both an impetus and also a push to take that viewpoint. Not everybody would be wanting to do it, but whomsoever wants to do it, there is an important lesson from your own career. What are your thoughts, Guru? Because it's not an easy thing. Because, for example, being in ICER, generally speaking, the orientation is more towards academic. Academic in the sense research is very kind of trying to go a little sometimes not very connected to the immediate applications. But there are also my colleagues who have done that very effectively. But in your case, I have seen you doing not only doing it but doing it successfully. Could you tell us how are you able to take both academic viewpoint and industry academia kind of interface?
Right. So the CSIR is a Council for Scientific and Industrial
Hmm.
Research. So in a sense, places like NCL already had that built into their DNA, where you would do high quality fundamental work and also interface. Now, I think those were the wonderful days of NCL where you could do very high quality fundamental work, and if you just wanted to do that, that would be fine. You could do mostly industry consulting, that would be fine. The lab as a whole had a balance, right? And that was very important. But what that meant is when you joined, you also had people who could hold your hand and help you make those connections to people in industry. The early 2000s is also when a lot of global industry was looking at India as an option, because the markets were growing, and so there was reason for them to have a presence in India, but also because of the fact that anyway they were just hiring Indians in their research laboratories everywhere else in the world. So why not set up something in India? So you might be aware of this, but the Jack Welch Technology Center that GE built in Bangalore really came out of very deep collaborations that they had with NCL. So they had starting the early 90s built these collaborations with NCL.
Yeah.
People like Sivaram
Some-
and
yeah.
were key to some of those things. I think they ended up filing of the order of 100 patents
Right, yeah,
together over the 10
that
15 years
polymer
that they worked.
division, right? Because
Mostly the
the
polymer
GE
division.
polymers, the
Right. And so when they were looking to set up another research facility, India made sense, right? It could have been Pune, unfortunately it wasn't, but so that really came from this kind of deep engagement that we had. Part of it was compulsion, right? Part of it was the fact that the balance of payments crisis happened in the early 90s,
90s,
which
yeah.
forced institutions to look for other funding. Academic institutions would have had a hard time at that point, especially, but places like NCL had visionary leaders like Mashelkar, uh, Paul Ratnaswamy, Sivaram, who really made that transition happen where they could work seamlessly with industry. They were doing high quality science that was anyway relevant. Power, I'm an engineer, right?
Yeah.
So, um, what I tell my research group is that when you do research, right, you want to do things that will either change the way people think or the way people live their lives. You have to have one of those two things. Otherwise, your research is meaningless. So,
Absolutely.
and as an engineer, we are more likely to do things that will help people change the way they live, right? So you want to build something that has consequences eventually for technology. It could be a deeper understanding. It could be building a product, whatever it is. Um, and so so for me that was not hard. I had people who would help make connections to industry. A lot of industry visitors would come to NCL. I mean, across the board we'd have companies from across the world come visit NCL and say, how can we do business
Do
with you?
business. Okay.
And so that was not hard because I think the environment was there, and I enjoy it, right? So as a personally, I think I don't really see a disconnect from doing quality science and doing things that are work with industry. There's a lot of work that I've done that I've never published. I
Mm,
probably
mm,
never will, and that's fine because I still enjoy doing it. We file for patents around that in some cases,
mm, mm.
and I still got to do work with some very smart students and do some very nice science as well.
Science. Yeah.
Some of that science was inspired by problems that I was doing with industry in a very, very abstract,
Abstract.
fundamental kind of a way. But if you think about problems with power transport,
Mm,
right?
mm,
A lot of it has to do with phonon transport and
mm.
in disordered materials,
Materials.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And also using these as examples for your classes makes it a lot more fun because then they see what the point of understanding phonon transport is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It absolutely makes sense what you're telling. So, during this particular phase where you were in NCL, you also were involved in the Exciting Science Group, which is one of the very important initiatives which you and many of other of your colleagues and generally a lot of people within Pune were interested and took an initiative. What were the origin and how did it went about? Because this is actually a very important group. There are so many people I have met in Pune who have some way or the other been influenced by that particular program. Could you please just give us a
Yeah,
gist
that
about
was
that?
absolutely remarkable. And it came out of something very strange. So this is a story which I don't think I've told. So 2008, I think they were turning on the LHC.
Mm,
Is
mm.
that right? It was
Yeah, yeah,
2008,
roughly, yeah, yeah,
2008, 2009, that area,
yeah.
right? My sister lives in Sanewadi, right
Mm,
across the street. And my niece was at that point like a fifth grader, sixth grader, something, right? She's just finished
mm.
her master's right now. But so she comes to me and says, oh, I hear all these newspaper reports saying that the world will come to an end because they're going to create a black hole. I'm thinking this is somebody who lives right next to scientists, right? Everybody she knows has a PhD,
Uh,
and so why is the ecosystem in
Yes.
Pune not benefiting from the fact that you've got people who can tell you about this
Uh,
stuff? So then I said, what I'm going to do is
mm,
I'm going to set up a series of talks. At that point, I just said, let's set up a series
mm,
of talks for school kids,
mm.
telling them about science and technology, telling them what is happening, telling them how research today connects to what's going on, and just getting them, interested in this
Interested in it.
stuff. And so that was it, right? So then, I talked to students in my lab. They set up an elementary website. The venture center had taken off. There was some space there
Mm.
because I figured, with all the security restrictions in a national lab, I couldn't get so many people in.
Yeah.
Advertised it, and we just sent out a thing. And I got my one of my colleagues to give a talk, Chetan Gadgil, whom
Good,
you know
good.
well, and he gave the first talk in the series was why P plus C plus M equals B, right? And
Yeah.
it's brilliant, right? And so we
Yeah.
advertised. I was thinking, okay, maybe
Yeah.
like 40, 50 kids will show up. We had a traffic jam on Pashan Road. So at that point, we still had security checking everybody. I was like, let them go, right? All of Pashan Road was blocked because there's so many people, and we didn't realize there's such an appetite, right?
Absolutely.
And so people were driving from all over. They were bringing their kids here. For a while, there was a school from Baramati. They would put 20 kids in a bus and bring
Send.
them
Yes.
every time we had a talk on Sunday. So we just realized, oh wow, there's people who really
Yeah.
want this stuff,
Yeah.
and we are a publicly funded institution. We should do
Good.
this,
Yes.
and that's how it started. And then ICER wasn't there when he
Mm,
started this.
mm,
I mean,
mm.
there was really nobody
No.
in
Yeah.
ICER
Yeah.
at
Yeah.
that point.
Yeah.
But then people came along, and it became a joint venture, right? So I had co-conspirators,
Mm.
Sutirth, whom
Truth.
you've
Yeah.
also spoken to as part
Yes.
of this, and several others who Sayam Sengupta is
Sign.
now at ICER
Sign.
Kolkata. So several of us came together to start organizing this, and we found willing volunteers from the huge community that we have in Pune, Mumbai, um, and across. So ICER and NCL anchored it, but we got people from all
People.
over to come and speak at some of these events. And then it just grew, right? Because then people wanted more, right? We
Mm,
were doing these talks once a month. They said, oh, why don't you run summer workshop? Because we have kids who really like to do more science. And so we then figured that at that point we didn't need any resources. It was
mm,
run out of my
mm,
lab. My students were running the website.
mm.
It grew too big, right? So then we raised funding. And that's the amazing thing. Pune has corporates who say, "Oh, this is
This is,
worth
yeah, yeah,
doing. This is,
absolutely.
for the ecosystem in Pune." So we had people like Forbes Marshall, Praj, DSM, who had set up a research
Mm.
center in Pune, persistent for a
Yeah,
while.
that's it. Yeah.
A lot of them came together and said, "We will put in money," and we then had one person, and then later on we had two full-time people helping with this because it just got too big.
Growing.
So then 2011 was the International Year of
Mm.
Chemistry.
Mm.
We ran workshops. We had 1,200 students come and do experiments,
Like,
hands-on experiments from all over the city, and places like Baramati
yeah.
and so on. And so it really grew. And I think over the time that we were doing this, unfortunately, it wound down when I left Pune and to go to Mumbai. But we ran it for about 10 years, and in that time, we must have reached out to over 15,000 students in Pune. And
Easily
absolutely,
more than that.
sometimes
More than
I
that.
walk on the street and somebody tells me, "Oh, I decided to do science because we came to this program."
Yes.
It's so
Yeah,
gratifying.
absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
10 years we did this. I absolutely loved
Well,
it, right? I mean, most of my Sundays were gone. My wife was very unhappy with me for a while, saying, "You're never around," right? And but my kids would go to these programs. My wife
yeah.
would come to these programs. It was amazing, and it just grew to you have two full time people. There's a lot you
You
can
can.
do,
Yeah.
and ICER was supportive, NCR was supportive. After the first year, we just got all our
Yeah.
funding for this activity from corporates. So there were local corporates who were very supportive of doing this in Pune. So I absolutely loved it, and unfortunately, I don't have as much time to do this
Yeah.
because my family lives in Pune, so I
Mm.
shuttle back and forth. But when I was doing this, I
It
absolutely
was. It
enjoyed it.
was.
And you gave talks as part
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
this.
In fact, it's not only the talk, but the interaction I had. It was one of the best I've had ever, because the kind of enthusiasm, school children, in fact, I keep telling this to a lot of people, even on the podcast. I've been mentioning that it is not very difficult to take science to children. In fact, that they are the biggest audience for science, because that curiosity, and also there is some kind of unfettered interest in science. It's adults which are more difficult sometimes to do that, but exciting science. I have seen parents and children sitting in big numbers.
Yeah, so every talk we would get
Yeah,
100 plus audience, and
fabulous,
yeah,
fabulous.
it was an amazing
I
experience, I
was
think. And I think it was just right time, right?
right,
We had colleagues who were just at the right point in their careers that they were supportive.
supporting.
The environment in NCL and ICER when we started was
Yeah.
incredibly supportive. People were supportive, corporates were supportive, my colleagues were supportive. It was just absolutely wonderful.
No, fabulous, fabulous. Because that actually has also seeded a lot of people a kind of an interest in doing something which is at the interface of science and society. See, many of us, to be very frank, within the institution, for example, at ICER, are not well equipped. I'm not telling across, are not very well equipped to, let's say, do something totally at an industry scale kind of stuff. But it's much easier to, for example, interface with the society, kind of rub on the excitement to other people. And there are a lot of people who have taken this and made careers now. You can see there's a lot of influence through Exciting Science Group, and many of them, including our science activity center and other things, has got a lot of impetus from programs like Exciting Science Group. So now we have just looked at this aspect, Guru, of your own research and this kind of outreach and interfacing with the society, both in terms of industry research and also the kind of outreach. Uh, you also have been mentoring a lot of students in research programs, and what has been your experience there?
So yeah, you mean my PhD?
PhDs, and even I think even the postdocs. I have seen
Right,
so many
PhD
of
and
the
postdocs. Yeah,
postdocs
right.
you've been.
Yeah, so senior.
Yeah,
So
so,
yeah, so not we're not talking about undergraduate.
undergrad.
Yeah, so I've not had a very large number of students or a large group, either at
Mm,
NCL
mm,
or at IIT. But I've had some very talented students
mm,
who've gone through this process, right? And um, again, I mean, my ask when I talk about, so when I have PhD students in my group, I typically really don't assign them a problem for a while. I give them broad areas and I let them explore.
mm,
It's a very inefficient process if you
mm.
think about just getting in there and publishing a bunch of papers, which I think seems to be the way of doing it
Agree.
today.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I think what's most important for a PhD student is to learn how to define a problem, not really
Yes.
solve a problem. That's of course important, but those tools hopefully you have, or those are not the hard part. The hardest part is to figure out what is the right problem to work on.
Work on. Absolutely.
And so I think that exploration that I'd like my PhD students to do, it all doesn't always work, right?
Mm.
So there's a kind of PhD student who will take that on as a challenge and do it. There are others who will not do anything and just wait to be given a
Mm.
problem. So that has so some of my earlier on, I've had PhD students who worked with me for some years and said your style doesn't work for me, and which is perfectly
Yeah.
fine. Right?
Yeah.
You're still friends with a lot of those people, but so for people who are willing to do that, I think it's a nice experience to be
Experience.
given the freedom to do that. Luckily funding has not been an issue,
Yeah.
so if, whatever problem it is, we find ways of supporting that. We don't do very expensive science,
Mm.
luckily. Soft matter
Yeah.
and
That's one of
polymer physics
the
is
things.
is
Yeah.
tabletop for the large part, so it's not too expensive to do some of those things. It's always been possible to do that. And yeah, I've been lucky to have some very very talented students who've come in, and several of whom have gone on to careers in
Correct.
academia. Strangely, from my group, I've not had a lot of students who've gone to
Mm.
industry. Yet there are a
Mm.
few, but more who've gone to
Academics.
academia.
So you also made a transition because you then went from kind of national laboratory to academics back. What is that transition about, and what was the motivation to do that?
So I moved from NCL, where I was there
Mm.
from 2001 to
Mm.
2019, and
Mm.
then I moved to IIT Bombay in late 2019, just before the pandemic.
Mm. Mm.
Um, so for me, IIT Bombay is
Mm.
also like home, right? I was an undergraduate there. I know a lot of the faculty very closely, and I've had those connections over the years. So that was a sort of an easy
Easy.
transition for me. And Mumbai, Pune, for me, like I said,
Yeah.
Western Maharashtra
Yeah.
is home.
Yeah.
So that was not the.
Mm.
I think it was not a particularly
Mm.
hard transition to make. In terms of what I
Mm.
do, it's still teaching and
Teaching.
research. Right? The big difference is the undergraduate
Mm. Mm.
classes. Right. So when I teach a large class at NCL, that would have been 10 people,
Yeah.
right, or
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
15
Mm.
people. I've taught classes jointly between ISER Pune,
Yes.
NCL,
Yes.
and ISER Bhopal.
Kind of,
It's been interesting, but
NPTEL kind of thing also.
not in NPTEL. This
Uh,
is just the what do you call it? The where you have the students come online.
this is the knowledge in some connect. There is some network, knowledge
Right. So there
network.
are some classes
Yeah.
at some classrooms in NCL and
Yes.
at
Yes. Yes.
where you can do these video
Yeah. Yeah.
conferences. Actually, it's
Yeah.
remarkably easy
Mm.
because they can speak and they can hear
Yeah.
you. It's
Yeah.
almost like being in the
Yeah.
same classroom. No, so the teaching large undergraduate classes of 100 where uh, that was really the big
Mm.
difference. But that's more administrative because you have to learn to work with
Yeah.
TAs to
Yeah.
structure the whole thing. So when you teach these classes, I think a lot of your time just goes into administratively
Mm.
structuring the class more than anything else. But that was, I think, fun.
Mm.
I've been on the other side of that equation,
Yeah.
and so
Yeah.
it was not that difficult to sort of cross the table and go to the other side as such. So in terms of my work, there's not been a tremendous
Tremendously.
change.
Okay.
For the last 10 years or so, my focus has largely been on soft materials and sustainability.
Sustainability. Yeah.
So the idea is with plastics, this is something which is very in your face when you're producing such a large volume of plastics, and we have a very um, um, uh, uncoordinated way of
Mm.
disposing
Mm.
disposing our garbage. That leads to leakages in the
Mm.
system, which cause a lot of problems. And so, understanding that, but also understanding what happens to soap when you wash your hands in the sink. Where does it go? Right at the end, where does it end
Absolutely.
up?
Absolutely.
Those are the kind of things that started bothering me a
Mm.
lot more. And so we got into that. We did some projects initially when I was at NCL on lipid based
Lipid.
materials
Mm.
for delivering
Mm.
agrochemicals. We started doing some stuff with waste pickers in Pune,
Mm.
developed some
Mm.
technology for making 3D printable
Mm.
waste plastic. So things like that. So we've sort of been working on it, and that's really been the big focus of what we've been doing at IIT Bombay as well. A lot of emphasis now in my group on understanding the end of life of plastics. How do you look at
Mm.
recycling, chemical recycling, thermomechanical recycling? How do plastics break up to form microplastics and nanoplastics? That's been a theme that we've
Team.
been
Yeah.
exploring a
Yeah.
lot in my group in the last few years.
Yeah, because I am also aware of the work you and your collaborators have been doing. Sanat Kumar at
Right.
Columbia University, fabulous work. In fact, the recent December meeting, there is a very famous meeting. I'll also come to that, which is called as a Conflu, which
Mhm.
Guru had a lot of part of the crime he is
Right.
of initiating that very important meeting. That sustainability question is so important,
Right.
Guru. In fact, at least in my own personal perspective, climate change problems and sustainability are probably the biggest problems, because they are sometimes not given attention because the danger is not kind of imminent right at that junction. But in long term, it is probably the most important problem. uh, Given that your uh, exposure and also research interests were in polymers, this connection has been also fabulous. And do you think also there is enough effort going on in India towards this end?
There is so sustainability will come at a cost,
Hmm, hmm,
right? And the Indian consumer is extremely cost sensitive.
hmm,
So some of that will come from younger people
hmm.
pushing this, and therefore government bringing in mandates.
Mandates.
And that is coming, right? I mean, we are moving towards what's called extended producer responsibility, which
Hmm.
means that if you produce a material, you're responsible for it. So if I'm producing stuff that goes and makes plastic bags, eventually I am responsible for making sure all of
Making sure.
that is collected and disposed of in a responsible manner. So some of this will come from mandates, I think, and some of this will come from you know um, consequences that we have not thought of when we start making so much of this material. So I think this is tremendously important.
Hmm.
Microplastics, nanoplastics, for example, is something that the world over we don't really understand what the implications of this are and what consequences are. And this is something that we're working on. You spoke about climate change.
Hmm.
Over 90% of terrestrial microplastics come from tire wear, and
Wow.
these are particles that and this is something that I'm doing
Hmm.
jointly with another friend of
Hmm.
yours, Shankar Ghosh,
Shankar
who you know
Ghosh, yes,
well,
TFR.
and
Yeah.
Sanat has got interested in that as
Hmm.
well recently. Is to really just understand what kind of particles get generated when you have tire. And you think about it, this is black
Hmm.
carbon particles
Hmm.
they're throwing out into the environment. Some of these are very small and they stay suspended for a long time, which means they get swept up
Hmm.
in and transported over long distances, and also influence, for example, scattering of
Hmm.
light.
Hmm.
All the energy that we have, apart from nuclear energy, comes from sunlight.
Yeah.
And so if you change those patterns, you change a lot of things in terms of climate. So these are problems that have implications for human health. You're
Human.
breathing
Yeah.
this stuff. It has implications for climate and climate change. These are important problems.
Absolutely, absolutely. This is, in fact, I keep telling even to some of my students who are graduating, doing their PhDs, finishing up. There are so many, problems out there. The kind of training you get in basic sciences, if used correctly and in a way which is slightly more oriented towards particular questions, they are there are many to really address. And thanks to that kind of initiative, because there's now reasonable understanding that there are important problems to be solved within the society, which is also kind of critical. So I want to also just touch upon the meeting called Conflu,
Hmm.
which you really, have played a very critical role in establishing. It is a annual meeting which happens generally in December, which is co-organized with a consortium of people who are interested in rheology. There is also actually an association related to that, but I'm not going to go into the specific details. But tell us the origins of that particular meeting group, and how
Right.
did you get started with that, and what were the.
Right. So the complex fluids meeting
Hmm,
started in 2001 in Bangalore.
hmm,
It's 2001 or 2002?
hmm,
2002
hmm,
in Bangalore. So first meeting was organized by ISC,
hmm,
and it was organized at what was used to be called a DST school.
hmm,
So DST would fund you to run a school which was aimed at PhD students and college teachers, and at the end of the school you could do a small symposium. So the whole theme for the initial a few times it was run was a school which was like a 3 or 4 day school. You'd come and there would be people who teach basic topics in this in this advanced
hmm,
area, but sort of basic topics in this. And then that would then have a 2 day symposium where you would have people come and give talks on their research. And this was small, right? I mean, you would have a small number of people who could give talks, because there would only be one session, and there would at best be maybe about 20 talks in something like this. And that was the model in which this was run for many, many years. And this was a nice meeting because it brought together physicists, chemical engineers, chemical physicists, at that point, not yet biologists and things like that, maybe biophysicists and so on. And then that ran, that was a great meeting, right? So Prabhu Nath and Sriram Ramaswamy and
Yeah.
Kumaran organized
Yeah.
this meeting. It was a wonderful meeting, and I think the community really felt that this was great. Now, one of the things in doing science is you need to be able to bounce ideas of people, and it's very important to have a community in which you
Community.
do
Yeah.
this, right? Where you
Yeah.
can go talk to people, discuss science. That's how science grows. And we've never really had this strongly in India. There are other meetings. SPSI has meetings like Macro that's held once every 2 years, CRSI and so on. But the broader community did not have a meeting, and the soft matter community did not have a meeting of this kind. And so, this was then run again as a small meeting in 2005 at NCL, but that was just a day long meeting with very, very few talks. And then at a few other places, IIT Kanpur, IIT Bombay, and so on and so forth. But the format stayed the same, which was which was a DST school, which really funded this other meeting that came at the end of that. And that was a format until 2014. That was held at JNC.
JNC.
Ganesh
Yeah. Yeah.
Subramaniam organized that meeting. But the community had really grown, and at some point, I when I spoke to people in the community, they felt, it's a small set of people. It's the same set of people giving talks. When am I going to be able to give a talk, right? So I'm not even going to bother attending. And that is not what you want from a
Yeah.
community. You really want a large meeting where you can come in. There'll be contributed talks. It's not like there's one set of people who are getting invited every time.
Absolutely.
And so we then bid to organize this meeting. So it was not me alone who was.
Yeah.
I had partners in
Yeah.
crime,
Of course.
Apratim,
Yeah.
Shiva
Sure.
Patil,
Yeah.
and Sarika.
Side.
So we said, we will do this in Pune, but we said we are not going to do it the same way, right? Because we want to really make this professional meeting run on a basis. Before this, it was complicated to organize. You had to write a DST grant. You had to do all of this paperwork. You had to raise money from elsewhere. For one person to do this is just a lot of work. So the enthusiasm to organize a meeting was small, and you really had to go find people who had to be coerced to organize this meeting. So if we want to do it in a way that is very bare bones, the science has to be top quality. We don't care about the food. Well, like I said that because I don't care about the food. So Apratim was much more particular about having good quality food. Apratim and Sarika were. So we had both, right? So we had good food as well.
Yes.
But we said, we're going to run a bare bones meeting, no frills. Nobody's going to get picked up. Nobody's going to get, any special privileges. Everybody pays a registration fee.
Yes.
And we use that to cover the meeting. And so the whole idea was to have a high quality meeting where people would be really excited to come, and run it with contributed and invited talks. And we did the first meeting of that kind at ISER Pune. And it went very well. So we suddenly went from 40, 50 people attending the meeting, 15 to 20 people giving a talk, to 100 people giving a talk, and 300 people attending the meeting. And it went down very, very well. And that's been the format since. Now the meeting is more like 500 people.
Yes.
But the number of talks unfortunately hasn't changed. The community has grown even more.
Yes.
And so this is a challenge, right? To find a way of doing this. So when we had the first meeting in Pune, we could have a lot of slots for students. And I think it's very important for students to
Absolutely.
be able to give talks. My students have to go to the APS or to some meeting outside the country to give a talk. There is no meeting in the country where graduate students are able to give a talk. So I think we really need to up that somehow.
Absolutely.
So I'm happy to say I'm probably the only person who's attended every single Conflu meeting.
Yes.
And I do it because I love it. I love the community, I think it's part of my social responsibility
Yes,
to be able to contribute to that community and help build it, and which is what I've done in a small way.
Fabulous. Wow, this is very fascinating to really also know the origins of the meeting. So we're going to actually lighten up the conversation a little bit. Tell us a little bit about how you relax generally. I know you are busy. You also commute back and forth between Mumbai and Pune. But generally, what is your kind of process of relaxation? What do you do generally?
So I have two teenage boys, and so they keep me on my toes and busy. They're both, fairly active in
Yeah.
sports, and
Yeah.
so I like I like playing sports. I don't do as much of it.
Mm.
So more than actually playing sports now, I will go for a run,
Right. Right.
not with my kids, with my wife,
Right.
or go for a walk or something like that. Go to the again. Pune is amazing, right? You
Yes.
have the Tekdi, which is a local
Yes.
hill,
Yes.
and you
Yes.
have paths that will take you 13, 14 kilometers, and it's absolutely wonderful. It's
Wonderful.
wooded. You've got peacocks on
Yes.
top. It's very beautiful. So I do that fairly often. I read. I
Mm.
still
Yeah.
enjoy reading. I have again, Pune houses are larger than in Mumbai, so I have a study which is, one wall is just full of books.
Wow. Wonderful.
So I
Wonderful.
really enjoy reading even now. Yeah, and yeah, that's um, when I can. I like hiking.
Mm.
So a month ago, almost actually exactly a month ago to this date, I was on at the Everest Base Camp.
Wow. Is it okay? Okay. I
So
did not know
so
this.
yeah.
Okay. Okay. Nice.
Uh,
Nice.
so yeah, so it's
Yeah.
I
Peak
think
of the
largely
summer.
that.
It's a great time to be there, right?
Well,
Like.
I went from minus 15 there to plus 40 in Pune and promptly fell ill. So I was down for about a week with the flu.
Oh,
But
is it? Okay.
yeah,
Okay. Fabulous, fabulous. That's very interesting. So, before we kind of also conclude, tell us a little bit about your kind of future plans. What are the questions and what are the kind of projects you are looking into or taking it up or you're already pursuing?
yeah. So so I, as I mentioned, I'm increasingly concerned about materials in the
Mm,
environment,
mm,
and the whole idea that worked in the past for us was this idea of a linear economy, right? So you mine crude, make
mm,
materials, use it, and throw it away. And this was not just petrochemical based materials, but everything else, right? This was true for metals, it was true for a lot of other things. Now, this is not a sustainable
mm,
model, right? And so going ahead, we have a problem with energy. We 90% of the crude that we mine goes into fossil based fuel, which leads to problems with carbon dioxide and with global warming. But the 10% of that goes into chemicals and petrochemically derived materials like polymers give rise to other materials problems if we don't find a way of using them right.
mm,
So I think to me this is going to be one of the most important
mm.
problems of our times, and I'm very excited to understand the ramifications of this problem and then to see if there are things one can do to mitigate
Mitigate.
this. I don't think we're ever going to go away from plastics as a material.
Mm, mm,
It's just very difficult to beat the property profile of plastics. You're not going to replace it with metal. You're not going to replace it with cellulosics. You're not going to replace it with
mm,
ceramics. So I don't think that there is an alternative. But do I really need to be able to do I really need to be to mine
mm.
so much petrochemicals that I'm making 400 million tons of plastic, virgin fresh plastic every year, or can some of that become feedstock for my chain as at the end of their life? So these are things that I'm very excited by, and these are problems that I think are going to last me a while,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So
Indeed, they actually are probably also the most relevant problems to be solved for the betterment of humanity, because it actually cuts across everybody, right? It
right,
doesn't really just only confine the problem to one region or one class of people,
right.
and therefore of very high relevance. So, Guru, as usual, it has been educative, illuminating, fascinating, and fun
I've
to
enjoyed
talk to you.
talking to you. I was very nervous about this because I don't really think I have anything interesting or unusual to say. But thank you so much for having me, and I've enjoyed the conversation.
So listeners would surely disagree with you that it was not neither you had nothing to say. There's so much to learn from Guru as usual, and it has been always a pleasure to talk to you, Guru. So this is Pratidhani signing off with the one and the only Guru Swami.
Thank you very much.